So in these videos, we're going to go into a little bit about text and typography, so an introduction to typography. I'm going to start off with some terminology so that we're all on the same page when we're talking about the parts of the letters when we're looking at our type. So here we've got the word typography spelled out, and the arrows here point to various parts of the letter forms, or various things that you might want to define, such as uppercase and lowercase. And so what you might see when we get to the time when you have an exam is you might see an image like this where you're going to need to identify the various parts. And here we have the things actually on there, and there's actually some extra pieces in there as well. So knowing what an uppercase letter versus a lowercase letter, knowing things like the ascender is the part of the letter that comes above the X height, etc. So in the next few slides, we're going to go over some of the kind of top level, most important things to understand about the parts of the letter form. And hopefully we can use these when we're discussing our typefaces, when we're discussing the look of our type and how it then adds to emotion. So here's another image that shows you, again, some of those same things. So the baseline is a really great one to start off with because where all of our letter forms are going to sit, kind of the line, if you drew an invisible line underneath the word that you're going to be working with, that's the baseline. And so everything kind of works off of that as an axis. Think of it like if you were drawing a graph. So there are going to be a little, as you can see here with, say, the S, you might get a little bit that goes under the baseline that isn't going to be considered a descender. Descenders are things that go below the baseline. So if there's a curve, but it's basically where the type actually sits if you draw that imaginary line. So as you can see here on that S, some bits go below. Now, when you are putting, in this case, we're just going to be working with one word, but if you're setting large amounts of text, baselines can be really useful in terms of setting things to look like they're lined up with each other. So you can use that imaginary line as a way to line up other elements to make them look cleaner, make it look more cohesive, and basically give your whole piece a much more smooth finish, let's say. Now, as I just referred to, things that drop below the baseline are called descenders. They descend from the baseline. So lowercase g, lowercase p's and q's, anything that has a tail y, those all descend from the baseline. And again, this is going to be important when we think about setting multiple lines of text, because sometimes you'll have things kind of come crashing together if you set it so that the words are too close together on two different lines. So it's important to be able to talk about what the descender is doing, and also in the case of our emotive type, what it looks like. You know, is it blocky? Is it smooth? Again, using various descriptive terms can kind of help us think about how the different letter forms communicate differently. And so here the G is the descender. Now an ascender is going to be what is going to come above the X height. So we'll talk about the X height being the kind of equivalent of the baseline but for the top. But again, in this case, you can see the top of that S goes above that other imaginary line that I will define in a moment. But you can see the G doesn't, and things like F and T's, they come above. So if you think about if you had two lines of type and some of them have F's, some of them have Y's, the descender from the Y and the ascender from the F, if you set things too close together in terms of the line space between them, they can come crashing together. So it's important to be able to understand what parts of words might stick up or stick down so that way you can space things in a good way. And cap height's pretty easy to understand. It's the height of your capital letters. Some of them are self-explanatory. Now, the A is usually going to define the cap height because it's very blocky. It's also the first letter of the alphabet. Now, like the baseline, things with curves might either go above or be below. Again, curves kind of get to bend the rules a little bit, and it's mostly based on what looks good to our eye. Now, that X height I mentioned. Again, this one is pretty self-explanatory in that it is the height of the letter X. Like the A, it's very blocky. It's used to, again, define what elements go above it for ascenders. And it gives us a sense of that's what we're going to base our point size on. So two things that you can have your ascenders reach up higher, you can have your cap height be higher, but if their X height is the same, the space between the baseline and the top of the letter X, if that's the same, then they're the same point size. So this can be why you can set two different fonts at the same point size, but one of them feels larger than the other. And it has to do with how the ascenders and descenders kind of are formed in relation to the rest of the letters. So this is why it's good to have a sense of what the terms are so that we can talk about how these different changes can affect the feel of the type. So here we can see the fact that the reason that we have the X height being the height of the X rather than, say, going from the cap height and doing half of it is that, unlike how we were taught in school, we don't actually write letters in this grid that's even between the top of the capitals and the bottom of the words. Usually, the X height is actually more than half of the distance between the cap height and the baseline, as you can see here with the word bone. If you were to take, as you can see, the capital B here, from the bottom, the baseline down at the bottom of the B, to the top of the B, where the top of the cap height is, if you did half of that, it actually would cut off a big portion of those letters. So we actually are more used to reading things where the X height is closer to the cap height than it is to the middle. And here we can see all of these fonts have the same point size. The space between the baseline and the X height is the same in all of them. But things like the middle of the bottom row will feel smaller because the cap height is a lot smaller than, say, the one and the top left. So keep that in mind when you're setting things, when we're talking about in your emotion, does it feel big or feel small? The choice of font can help with this feeling.